The study at Ashvale Park had not been cleaned in 41 days. Mrs. Bracewell, the housekeeper, kept a private tally in the margin of her household ledger. A small pencilled mark each morning when she confirmed that the mahogany door at the end of the east corridor remained shut. The maids passed it with their eyes averted and their caps pulled low, as though not looking directly at it might spare them from whatever responsibility lay on the other side. The footman delivered trays to the threshold and retreated without a word, leaving whatever had been brought the previous evening untouched on the floor beside it. Once young Thomas had knocked and received no answer. He had knocked again, 3 slow raps, and the silence inside had felt so absolute, so deliberately maintained, that it had pushed back against the door like a physical pressure, a wall made of nothing at all. He had picked up both trays and carried them back to the kitchen without tasting the cold soup himself, as he might ordinarily have done. He told Cook he had not been hungry. Cook did not believe him, but she did not press. This was Ashvale Park in the autumn after the Duke of Ashvale buried his wife and his infant son on the same grey Thursday in October. The park itself had begun to look as though it understood the feeling. The lawns had been scythed once at the end of September, and not since, and the long grass bent and straightened in the November wind like something restless, never settling in any direction. Leaves gathered in the stone gutters of the fountain in the forecourt, and the water in its basin had gone still and dark, the surface broken only by the occasional leaf falling from the overhang of the copper beach, each one landing with the small sound of something finally giving in. Rooks had taken up permanent residence in the elm avenue, and their noise in the mornings was the only real sound the house produced, argumentative and ongoing and heedless of everything below them. The 12 indoor staff moved through the house in a kind of muffled choreography, speaking in half voices, taking the back stairs, keeping the drapes in the formal rooms half drawn, as though the house itself were a patient that needed to be kept from too much stimulation. The silver went unpolished. The formal dining room was set and cleared untouched every morning by a footman who performed the ritual without comment, laying the single-place setting with the care of someone who did not quite believe it was pointless. The Duke was 32 years old. His name was Edmund Calder. Before the Thursday in October he had been described, in the only way Regency society truly described men of his station, as formidable. He had a reputation for exactness in business, for keeping promises, and for having the kind of face that made people tell the truth to him without quite intending to. Some quality of attention he carried that made falsehood seem not worth the effort. His wife, Lady Catherine, had been considered the better-looking of the two, which was saying a great deal, because Edmund Calder was not a plain man. She had been gentle where he was precise. She had softened rooms simply by entering them, bringing with her a quality of warmth that did not demand anything from anyone, but was simply present, like sunlight through glass, heating whatever it reached without asking to be noticed. The servants had loved her in the way people love things they do not expect to be permanent, with a gratitude that always contains a small unacknowledged grief, as though they sensed even while she was alive that they were lucky to be near her, and that luck was not, strictly speaking, a reliable foundation for anything. Nobody had expected it to be this permanent. Edmund had been in the house when it happened. He had been in the adjacent room when Catherine laboured through the night, and the infant had come in the grey hours before dawn, early by the calculation of the physician, and the physician had said nothing that amounted to reassurance. Edmund had held his son for 3 hours. The child's name was to have been James, after Edmund's father, and James had lived for precisely those 3 hours, and then had not. Catherine had followed him before evening. Edmund had been present for both, holding her hand in the afternoon with the particular helplessness of a man who has believed in his capacity to manage the world and has discovered the limit of that belief in a single afternoon. The servants below had heard nothing. They had known from the changed quality of the silence in the house, which had shifted somewhere in the late afternoon from the tense silence of waiting to the settled silence of something concluded. The physician had come out of the room and spoken to Mrs. Bracewell. Mrs. Bracewell had sat down in the straight-backed chair in the corridor outside the study, and had stayed there for 10 minutes before she had stood up and begun the work of running a household in grief, which she had continued to do ever since. Edmund had gone into the study and closed the door, and he had not come out. Nora Ashby arrived at Ashvale Park on the 4th of November, which was a Monday, on the outside seat of the carrier's cart, from the village of Callow Edge, sitting beside a crate of turnips, making the journey to the kitchen, and a roll of fence wire going to the estate yard. She had a canvas bag, a reference letter from the rectory at Moorholt, where she had served as a general housemaid for 3 years, and a navy wool coat that had belonged to her mother, and was still, despite several hard winters, holding together at the seams. She was 28. She was not beautiful in any way that made strangers stop and look twice. But she had a quality that people who knew her remarked upon eventually, always in slightly different words but always describing the same thing, which was that she was entirely still. Not slow, not dull. Still she occupied precisely the space she stood in, and not 1 inch more, and there was something in this that made nervous people calmer when she was near, though she did nothing deliberate to produce the effect, and was probably not aware of it. Mrs. Bracewell met her at the servants' entrance with the door only half open, assessing her through the gap before widening it. The housekeeper was a compact woman of 50 with iron-grey hair and the manner of someone who had learned to anticipate disaster and prepare for it rather than be surprised. She looked Nora over for 30 seconds in the cold doorway. "You understand the situation here." Nora said she had heard something of it in the village. "What you heard is probably understated." Mrs. Bracewell opened the door wider. "His Grace does not see visitors. He does not attend meals in the dining room. He does not speak to the staff. He has not left the East Wing in 6 weeks. I do not know precisely what he does in that study, and I have made it a policy not to speculate, because the alternatives are either too sad or too alarming, and neither benefits the household. What I need is someone who will bring his evening tray to the door without becoming distressed by the absence of acknowledgement, and without gossiping about it in the kitchen afterward. The 2 girls I have tried before you found the assignment unnerving. One of them wept. I cannot have weeping in the corridor. I don't find silence unnerving." Mrs. Bracewell looked at her again with a slightly different quality of attention. "No, I don't suppose you do." She was given a small room on the 3rd floor at the back of the house, where the ceiling sloped and the window overlooked the kitchen garden and the stone wall beyond, and in the morning the light came through that window at an angle that was, on clear days, quite pleasant, reaching the foot of the bed first and the wall opposite an hour later. Her uniform fit well enough with one adjustment to the hem. Her duties ran from 6 in the morning until 8 in the evening, 6 days in 7. The evening tray for the study was the last task before she was free. The kitchen at Ashvale Park was a large, warm, competent place presided over by cook, whose name was actually Mrs. Hanford, but who had been cook for so long that the designation had become a title, and the original had been largely mislaid. She made the Duke's evening tray with the care of someone who believed that he might one day actually eat from it, who had made the private decision that preparing good food for someone who might not receive it was still better than preparing indifferent food for someone who might. There was always something warm, something simple, something that smelled of genuine comfort rather than formal duty. A bowl of broth with substance to it, made from the bones of whatever had been roasted that week. A dish of potatoes roasted in their skins until they split open and steamed. A slice of bread made that afternoon. A small preserve on the side. Cook had lost a daughter once, years before, and she put into the preparation of those evening trays everything she had learnt about the kind of loss that does not have an explanation or a remedy, and does not improve by being addressed directly, without saying so to anyone. She simply made the tray each evening and handed it to Nora and did not ask what happened when it reached the corridor. Nora took the tray on her first evening and carried it along the servants' corridor through the green baize door into the east wing. The carpet here was thick and old, a deep wine colour that had faded unevenly, so that the most walked paths were lighter than the margins. The wall sconces gave the kind of light that fell in pools rather than spreading, each one illuminating a circle of old plaster and gilt frame and leaving the spaces between in shadow. She counted the doors as she walked. Second on the left, third on the right. The corridor turned at a right angle, and then she was in the final stretch with the study at the far end. The tray from the previous evening was still on the floor outside the door. It had not been touched. The broth had congealed into a pale skin across the surface. The bread had gone hard. The napkin was exactly as it had been placed, folded in its careful way by cook's hands, and gone cold and still. Nora set her tray down, picked up the old one, and went back to the kitchen without particular haste. She returned 2 minutes later with a new tray and set it in place before the door. She did not knock. She stood for a moment in the corridor, looking at the closed door, and then she went back the way she had come. This was the pattern for the first 2 weeks. She found it, if anything, peaceful. The corridor in the evenings was very quiet, and the act of setting the tray down required a small and precise attention that she liked. She was a woman who had always found meaning in precision, in doing a small thing well and leaving it to do whatever good it could without hovering over it or checking on it or needing it to produce a visible result. She had no expectation that the door would open. She had no hope invested in the question of whether the tray went in or stayed out. She simply came each evening and set it down and stood for a moment and left. She did not find it unnerving. She was telling the simple truth when she had said so to Mrs. Bracewell. She had grown up in a house where silence was common and not always peaceful, and she had learned early to read its gradations. Some silences were empty, the silence of a room where nothing was happening and nothing was expected. Some were full of things that had not yet found their form, the silence that accumulates around grief or fear, or a decision being made slowly in the dark, the kind that has mass and pressure, and a distinct quality you can feel against your skin when you walk into it. The silence from behind that mahogany door was unmistakably the second kind. She could feel it each evening as she stood in the corridor, dense and pressurized, the kind that comes from a person who is doing something enormously effortful that nobody outside can see. She was not afraid of him. She examined this, in those early weeks, with the same honest attention she gave most things about herself, and concluded that it was genuine rather than bravado. He was grieving. People who were grieving deeply were sometimes angry, sometimes unreachable, sometimes both, and none of these things frightened her. She had been both herself. Once, after her mother, she had sat in her own small room for 10 days and not spoken to her sister unless spoken to, and she had felt during those 10 days that any voice, however kind, was an intrusion she did not have the strength to absorb. She had needed the silence the way a wound needs to be left alone, and she had felt, when people tried to speak to her cheerfully and draw her out, a very specific variety of fatigue, as though they were asking her to lift something far too heavy. She had, eventually, come out. When she was ready, when the silence had finally done what it needed to do. On the 15th evening she arrived to find that the previous tray was gone. Not on the floor, not untouched, not there at all. She stood very still in the corridor for a moment with the new tray in her hands. Then she set it down in the accustomed spot and walked back. In the kitchen she said to Cook, simply, he took the tray in. Cook's expression moved through several things rapidly and settled on something complicated and quiet. A full moment passed. Then, it became a different kind of routine after that. Some evenings the tray went in and some evenings it did not, and she could not establish a pattern. could not find the variable that determined which it would be. But there was a change in the atmosphere of the corridor, subtle enough that she could not have described it precisely even if she had needed to. The silence was still there, but it had altered. It had become aware of her. November deepened. The parkland went from tawny to bare grey, the trees stripped, the bracken gone flat and brown, the hillside beyond the estate wall revealed by the loss of leaf as a thing of pure bone and structure. The first frost came in the third week and silvered the gravel of the front drive and lay white across the kitchen garden beds and on the bare branches of the espaliered trees along the walled garden's south face. Nora had by now settled into Ashvale Park well enough to know its rhythms. She knew the particular creak of the third step on the back stair, the way the kitchen fire burned lower on still afternoons and needed banking before supper preparation. She knew that Thomas the footman was in love with the second housemaid, and had been for the better part of 2 years without managing to say anything useful about it, and that his strategy appeared to involve performing extremely competent footmanship in her general vicinity and hoping she would notice. She had, but she was not going to act upon it first. Nora knew that Mrs. Bracewell kept a small bottle of brandy in the bottom drawer of her desk for evenings when the atmosphere of the house pressed too heavily, and that she had used it twice in Nora's first 2 weeks. She knew that cook's bread was best on Tuesdays, when she used the older starter and let the dough sit longer than the recipe strictly required, and she had taken to scheduling her sharpest appetite for Tuesday afternoons. She liked it here, in the quiet, specific way she liked places where there was work to do and people who did it without theatrics. She had not seen the Duke. She had seen his absence in every room she passed through. She had seen him in the portrait at the head of the main staircase, which she passed each morning on her way to collect the linen from the upper floors. In the portrait he stood in a dark coat before a tall window, and the painter had caught something in his face that was not pride exactly, not severity exactly, but the particular expression of a man who believes that if he attends very carefully to the world will make sense to him. She looked at it every morning without quite meaning to. She thought it was probably still his face, under everything. She thought it probably hurt, precisely because he was that kind of man, to discover that the world did not keep its side of that particular arrangement. The night she first heard him was in the last week of November. She had set the tray down and was straightening, turning to walk back, when she heard movement on the other side of the door. Not footsteps, not the sound of someone approaching the threshold, the movement of a man shifting his weight in a chair, as though something had altered his position slightly, the small ordinary sounds of a person who is present in a room and not performing unconsciousness. She heard the soft sound of glass being set against a wooden surface, and then, distinctly, a low exhalation that was not quite a sigh and not quite a sound of pain, but somewhere between the two, the kind of sound that comes from a person who is very tired of the specific effort they have been making. She did not move for a moment. She stood with her hands at her sides and listened, and she felt, with the clarity of a thing she did not need to deliberate about, that she should not knock. That to knock would be to name a situation he was not ready to have named, to break a seal that was protecting something still unfinished. That what was required here was something she could not yet articulate in words. Only recognize when she encountered it. She left. She thought about it all the way back along the corridor, and while she put away the cleaning things, and while she banked the kitchen fire for the night. She thought about what it must be like to breathe inside that room, with the weight of everything pressing down. She thought about a man who had built his life on the premise that careful attention produces order, discovering in a single afternoon in October that attention is sometimes not enough, that grief does not respect the structures a person has built against it, that it simply gets in anyway, the way cold gets in, through every gap, however carefully sealed. She was not a sentimental woman, She did not impose emotion on situations that were already full of their own. But she thought about it, and that thinking was its own kind of companionship she could offer him no other way. The following evening she took the tray as always, walked the long corridor, set it at the door. She stood for a moment, and then she spoke. She pitched her voice low, the way you speak to someone in the same quiet room when you want the words to reach them without surrounding them. Cook has done the root vegetables in goose fat tonight. She does it when the frost has been hard. She says the warmth of the fat matters more than she can explain, though she has tried to explain it several times. She thinks it is something about the depth of the heat, going all the way through rather than sitting on the surface. She is probably right, though she says most things with that kind of certainty, and is usually right. She paused. The door said nothing. "I'll bring fresh tomorrow," Nora said, and walked back the way she had come. She examined it in her room later, trying to understand what she had done. She concluded that it had seemed right in the same wordless way that most right things seem right. It was the difference between knocking, which is a demand disguised as consideration, and speaking, which is simply the presence of another voice without any expectation attached. He could hear it or not hear it. He could lie in his study with the sound of her voice coming through the wood of the door like a letter slipped under it, something he could pick up or leave on the floor entirely as he chose. She spoke to the door again the next evening, and the one after. She described the frost and the particular smell of November deciding to become December, which was, she had always thought, slightly more interesting than either month, a smell that was neither cold nor the memory of warmth, but something hovering between the two. She told the door about the rook in the elm avenue that had built an extraordinarily untidy nest, visible from the kitchen garden path, which she had been watching for 3 days waiting for it to fall in the wind. It had not fallen yet, which she found genuinely impressive given the structural evidence. She heard him, on the 4th evening of this, make a sound from behind the door, brief, involuntary, the sound of someone who has encountered something inadvertently amusing while not being in the mood to find anything amusing, and who has failed to stop it in time. It was not laughter. It was the thing that comes just before a person remembers they are not supposed to find things funny. She continued with what she had been saying as though she had not heard it, because she thought that was what the moment required, and walked back along the corridor at the same pace as always. December arrived. She brought the tray each evening and spoke of the things she noticed. She told him about the behaviour of the spaniel, who belonged to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, who had taken to sleeping on the second step of the servants' stair with an air of proprietorial commitment that none of the humans had felt equipped to challenge. She described the way the ice had formed on the water barrel in the kitchen yard one morning in a pattern that reminded her of the coastal maps in an atlas her father had owned. She described Thomas and the second housemaid in entirely general terms, characterizing the whole affair as a small pastoral comedy, whose second act had stalled for reasons of pure cowardice. On the 6th evening of this, while she was midway through describing the pattern of the ice on the barrel, the door opened. He stood in the doorway. He was taller than the portrait had suggested, or perhaps the portrait had simply flattened him, as portraits do, removing the particular quality of presence that a person occupies in actual space. Edmund Calder in person was emphatically physically there. He was wearing a shirt that had not been pressed, and his hair was longer than it had been in the portrait, and he had the look of someone who has been existing in inadequate light for a long time, his eyes requiring a moment to adjust even to the low sconce glow of the corridor. Those eyes were dark brown, and they were looking at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone who is exhausted, but is, against their expectation, curious. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, the coastal map. His voice was rough from weeks of disuse, not cracked, just unpracticed, like an instrument in good condition that has been put away unplayed. What atlas? Nora held herself very still, the way you hold still when a wild thing is deciding whether to stay or go. My father had an atlas of the northern seas. I do not know who made it or precisely when. He bought it at an estate sale when I was 4 years old, and I was not allowed to touch it until I was 7. By then, I had stared at it for so long through the glass of the cabinet that I had most of it memorized. The coastlines of Iceland. The small scattered islands north of Norway, all the places where the water gets too cold for maps to be entirely trustworthy. He looked at her steadily. Then he looked down at the tray at his feet. He picked it up. He turned and went back into the study, and the door, which had swung wide when he opened it, swung partially closed again, but did not latch. A thin bar of amber firelight fell across the corridor floor, reaching her feet. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at that bar of light. Then she walked back the way she had come. She told no one. This seemed important. The other staff maintained a quality of attention around the Duke's situation composed partly of genuine care and partly of the natural human interest in a private drama, and she did not want to provide new material for either. The door was open partially the following evening when she arrived, perhaps 4 inches. Light from inside, warm amber, the quality of firelight mixed with lamp oil, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look considered. She could see the edge of his desk and the spine of a row of books. She set the tray down. "Good evening." The girl who talks. His voice came from somewhere deeper in the room. He was not near the threshold. He had simply left the door ajar. "I won't, if you'd rather I didn't." A silence, not quite as long as the ones before. Then, "You may." She stood in the corridor with her partial view of his study and told him that the frost had been absolute that morning, hard enough to have frozen the mud in the kitchen yard into ridged shapes that held their form until past noon. The rook's nest in the elm avenue had finally come down in the wind the previous night. The rook had been sitting in the elm this morning, looking at the wreckage with an expression that could only be described as affronted, which she found disproportionate given that the construction had never been sound. From inside the room the involuntary sound again, less restrained than before. Still not laughter, but closer to it, the thing that comes from a person who is beginning, despite themselves, to be drawn back toward the world. She said good evening and walked back along the corridor. December deepened into its darker weeks. The house observed Christmas in the understated way of a place that is aware the season is not appropriate in its usual form, but cannot entirely ignore it. A wreath appeared on the kitchen door. Cook made her spiced biscuits and left them in a tin on the kitchen table. The smell of warming spices moved through the lower floors and found the gaps in the old walls, drifting upward, persistent and comforting precisely because it was so ordinary, so attached to other Decembers that had been ordinary in the way one comes to miss. He came to the door every evening now. Sometimes he stood in the doorway and she talked from the corridor. Twice he retreated to the chair by the fire, and the conversation happened between them with him inside and her at the threshold, the door open a few inches, as though the gap of the previous weeks had been replaced by a different kind of gap, one made of air rather than wood. She discovered over these evenings that he was, under everything, a man of considerable precision and a dry wit that had apparently survived intact. When she described the atlas her father had owned in more detail, he told her about a map he had found in the library at Ashvale Park as a boy, a chart of a coastline that did not exist, presumably invented by the cartographer out of either optimism or commercial misdirection. He had kept it because he found the fraudulent coastline more interesting than the accurate ones surrounding it, more interesting precisely because someone had felt the need to invent it, which said something about the territory and about the person charting it. He did not smile when he said this, but there was something in his voice that was the intimate ancestor of a smile, held at a slight distance from expression maintaining itself. He began to ask her questions, about the kitchen, about the staff, about the ongoing situation of the 2 unnamed kitchen inhabitants and their stalled romance. He asked with the deliberateness of a man relearning how to be interested in things at a distance, reaching for ordinary curiosity the way you reach for a limb that has fallen asleep, carefully, not entirely certain it will respond. She answered without embellishing or flattening, describing the world of his house from the vantage of someone who moved through it at floor level, and she could see that this was useful to him, that it gave him something to locate himself in relation to, a geography he could trust while the larger one was still uncertain. He did not speak about his wife, he did not speak about his son, she did not invite him to. These absences were present in the room with them at all times, as present as the fire and the desk and the half-empty decanter on the side table, and Nora no more commented on them than she would have commented on the furniture. She trusted that if he ever needed to speak about them, he would know where she was. One evening in the middle of December he was in the chair by the fire, and she was at the threshold, and from inside the room came his voice, low and deliberate. "What happened to your father's atlas?" "It was sold after he died." "Along with the cabinet." "We needed the money. I have always been sorry about the atlas specifically, though I understood the necessity completely and would not have argued against it." He was quiet for a moment. "The northern seas." "Yes, there is a library here." He was looking at the fire. "There may be something of the kind among the maps." "I have not looked at the maps properly in some years." "I know. I dust the shelves on Thursdays." Something shifted in his face, the expression of a man who has just realized that his library, which he had thought of as a private and unattended place, has been faithfully maintained every week by a small woman with a cloth. He looked at her, and for the first time there was something in the look that was unmistakably warm. Not the warmth of someone who has recovered, but the warmth of someone beginning to remember what warmth is. "You dust it on Thursdays." "It is a very good library. Someone should." He looked at her for a long, slow moment. "Nora Ashby, you are not like the other girls. I am precisely like the other girls. I am simply less concerned about doors." He looked at her for a long time after that, and she met it with the steadiness that was her nature. And then she said good evening and walked back along the corridor. She lay in her room that night, and was very careful not to feel anything in particular. She was a housemaid. He was the Duke of Ashville. She had a canvas bag and a navy coat and a reference letter, and he had a house with a library that required dusting on Thursdays, and an estate that stretched to the edge of the visible world. These were not categories that permitted the particular quality of his attention to mean what it might have meant between two people standing on level ground. She told herself this clearly, without drama, the way she told herself any factual information, and then she lay looking at the ceiling for rather a long time before she went to sleep. But she thought, just before sleep, about the way he had said her name. 2 words, said with the care of a man who is not in the habit of saying things carelessly. Christmas evening she brought the tray as always, and had added to it, without asking anyone's permission, a slice of cook's spiced orange cake wrapped in a cloth. He was at the door before she had finished setting the tray down. He looked at the cloth-wrapped package. "It's Christmas." He looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she did not attempt to name. He picked up the tray and carried it inside, and the door closed fully for the first time in weeks. She stood in the corridor for a moment in the particular quiet that follows a small thing landing well, and then she walked back to the kitchen where Cook had left the fire up and the pot warm, and she sat with Cook for an hour in the comfortable silence of 2 women who do not need to perform anything for each other, and that was Christmas. January arrived with severity. Hard frost, pewter skies, cold that settled into the old stone and stayed. The parkland was a study in grey and white, beautiful in the way of things that do not care about comfort, and every morning Nora crossed the kitchen garden to the root cellar, and crossed back, and the cold was so clean it was almost pleasant. The way very cold water can be almost pleasant if you are already committed to it. On the 9th of January, a Wednesday, she saw him in the park for the first time. She was returning from the root cellar with a basket of stored carrots and parsnips, and she looked up along the kitchen garden path, and there, at a considerable distance between the elm avenue and the south edge of the park, a man was walking. He had his hands behind his back, and his head slightly bent, not bowed, not defeated, but angled in the way of someone attending very carefully to the ground under their feet, reacquainting themselves with the particular sensation of forward motion and the air outside. The rooks above him were making their usual noise. He did not look up at them. He walked to the far end of the avenue and turned and walked back, and at the turn she could see his profile briefly, the face from the portrait encountering the world again. Careful, and unhurried, and very alone. She looked away almost immediately. It felt private in the way of things that are being done with great effort, and without the possibility of an audience. That evening he was at the door before she had finished setting the tray down. "You were in the kitchen garden this morning." "Yes," you turned away. "I thought you probably weren't ready to be looked at." The expression that crossed his face then was the most complex thing she had yet seen from him. It held several things at once, among them something she could only call gratitude of the specific variety that costs something to feel, because feeling it means acknowledging that you needed what was given. He looked at her directly. "Come in, I want to show you something." She paused for only a breath, then picked up the tray and followed him inside. The study by lamplight was warmer than she had imagined from the corridor. The fire well built, the lamps at intervals across the room giving a good, even glow. She set the tray on the cleared corner of the desk and turned to find him at the far window, the one that overlooked the east garden. He pushed it open a few inches, letting in a thin current of cold, and he was looking down at something in the garden below. She came to stand beside him. In the east garden, in the raised bed nearest the old stone wall, a single snowdrop had pushed through the frozen crust of earth. It stood perfectly upright in the January darkness, pale and white and exact, an implausible thing in an implausible season, doing what it had come to do without apparent awareness of the difficulty. I noticed it this afternoon. It was not there yesterday. I have been looking at that bed for a week. She studied it for a long moment. They always come before you think the ground is ready. He looked at her. In the lamplight, from this proximity, she could see what the portrait had not captured, or had rendered differently, the amber that lived inside the dark brown of his eyes, near the centre, warm and particular. He was looking at her with something that she had been careful, for several weeks, not to name. She continued to be careful. But it was there, as tangible and unmistakable as the snowdrop below and the cold coming through the narrow window and the fire burning behind them. "I do not know how to thank you." "You don't need to. You came every evening, for weeks. You talked to a closed door. You needed someone on the other side of it." That was all it was. He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted with a small sound of wood settling. The cold came in through the open window in a thin ribbon. "Nora," she looked at him, "I have been trying to determine whether what I want to say to you is something I am permitted to say." She waited. "You are in my employ. You are considerably below my station by every measure society would care to apply. Every convention I was raised to observe would tell me that what I am about to say is improper, that it places you in a difficult position, that I am in some way taking advantage of the circumstances that brought you to this corridor each evening." He paused. "These things may all be true. I have thought about them carefully, and I cannot dismiss them." She was very still. The snowdrop in the garden below stood exactly as it had stood before. "Then perhaps don't say it for the conventions. Say it, or don't say it for yourself." He looked at her for a moment that was long enough that she thought he had decided against it. And then he said, "I would like to know you." not as the girl who brings my tray, not as the woman who is kind to a closed door. I would like to know you properly and honestly. I do not know yet what shape that would take, or whether it is possible in any form that would be fair to you, or whether you would want it. I know only that for the first time since October I have wanted something forward rather than backward, and you are the reason. The fire settled again. The snowdrop in the dark garden stood exactly where it had been, doing what snowdrops do, which is to simply be present without making demands. She said, "That is not something I know how to pretend I did not hear. No, and I won't pretend." He was looking at her with the most open expression she had yet seen from him. It was still not entirely open, because he was a man who would probably never be entirely open, and she had known this since the portrait, and had understood it as a fact rather than a flaw. Open enough. More open than this morning. More open than October. She thought it was quite a lot. I don't know what it would look like either. No, I don't. Outside, the rooks in the elms were settling for the night in their ragged way. One last exchange before the darkness made its demands. The sound fell away gradually, and then was gone. The snowdrops stood in the frozen bed without moving. What followed was not a simple thing. Nothing that involves station and grief, and two people who have begun something without a clear map forward, ever is. It required, over the weeks that came after, a patience that both of them had in different quantities for different reasons. He was patient with himself in ways he had not previously managed, allowing the return to ordinary life to proceed at the uneven and sometimes difficult pace at which such returns actually proceed, rather than the orderly pace at which one would prefer. She was patient in the way she had always been patient, with steadiness rather than indulgence, present without pressing, offering the world to him through the corridor of small and particular observations, trusting that he would find his way back to it when he was ready. He came to the library one afternoon in late January and spent 2 hours in the map section. 3 drawers of rolled and folded charts in the far corner that had not been opened in years. He brought to the kitchen door the following evening an atlas of the northern seas, published in Hamburg, which had been in the collection for decades without being examined. He did not give it to her as a gift. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened it, and said, "Here, the Faroe Islands. Here is where the cartographer appears to have guessed, rather than surveyed." And he read to her from it with the dry pleasure of someone sharing something they find genuinely interesting, his finger moving across the coastlines, comparing the inaccuracies with a precision she found entirely characteristic of him. Cook continued doing whatever she had been doing at the counter with great concentration. He came to the kitchen the following week, and the week after. Not always for the atlas, sometimes simply to sit at the table and be in a room where things were happening at a scale he could manage, where the sounds were the ordinary sounds of bread being shaped, and a fire being maintained, and someone humming something under their breath without being aware of it. He did not speak much on these visits. Cook spoke enough for both of them, her running commentary on the day and the weather and the behaviour of the rooks and whatever had arrived from the estate farms that morning, and he sat in his chair and absorbed it, the way a person who has been very ill sits in the sun during the first week of real recovery, not doing anything in particular, only receiving. On one of these visits, Nora was working at the far end of the table, sorting the dried herbs from the kitchen garden that needed replenishing into the store cupboard, and he had been sitting for perhaps 20 minutes in his usual chair when he said, without particular preamble, "Do you ever think about going back to Moorholt?" She looked up from the herbs. "No, I left because it was small, and I had done everything that was there to do. I don't miss small." He considered this, and this is not small. It is a very large house, Nora said, with a great deal still to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the herbs on the table and said, "What is that one?" "Rosemary. Cook uses it for the lamb when she can get it to dry properly, which depends on the autumn being dry enough before the first frost. This year it was, just barely. He picked up one of the dried sprigs and looked at it with the serious attention he brought to most things, turning it over, smelling it. He set it back down carefully. He said nothing. But he stayed another half hour, and when he left he did not go back to the study by the east corridor. He went through the main hall, and Nora heard from the kitchen the sound of the front door opening and the sound of the gravel crunching under his boots as he walked out into the January afternoon. She looked at Cook. Cook continued working. Mrs. Bracewell knew. She said nothing about it except once, very briefly, to Cook, in a tone that suggested the matter was settled rather than under discussion. Cook agreed with the same tone. Neither said anything further. In February the frost broke for a full week, and there was mud and the smell of earth beginning to think about spring, and the crocuses appeared along the east garden wall in purple and white, in the space around the snowdrop that had held its post since January. He asked her one afternoon whether she would walk with him in the garden. She said yes. They walked along the gravel path with the rooks overhead in the bare elms, and the garden coming slowly back into itself around them. He did not take her arm, and she did not offer it. They walked with a comfortable foot of space between them, speaking about the crocuses and the thaw, and the fact that the rook's nest, rebuilt since its collapse, had been rebuilt in a substantially more competent manner than the original, as though the rook had taken the structural criticism of the wind to heart and applied the lesson seriously. He looked at her when she said this. You notice everything. Someone should. He made the low sound she had come to know well, the full laugh now, brief and quiet and genuine, the thing that had been waiting since October to come back. It changed his face considerably. She filed this away without comment. He was quiet for a few paces, the gravel soft under their feet, the frost-loosened stones giving slightly with each step. He said, I have been thinking about what might be possible. She did not pretend to misunderstand him. Between us. He was looking at the path ahead, which was where he looked when he was saying something that cost him something. She did not draw his eyes from it. I have no clean answer. I know that the conventions are real and their consequences fall primarily on you. I know that I am still not entirely the person I was before October, and this is relevant to any honest offer. But I would like, very much, to try to find what might be fair and possible, if you would agree to that. She thought about her small room on the 3rd floor. She thought about the canvas bag and the navy coat, and the reference letter. She thought about what it was to be 28 years old with very little, and to be offered something she could not fully see the shape of, and could not guarantee would hold. She thought about the atlas her father had sold, and the coastal maps she had memorized through the glass of the cabinet, and the places where the cartographer had guessed rather than surveyed, had drawn a line where there was no verified land, and trusted that something would be there when the ships finally arrived. She thought that most true things require you to stand in the uncertain territory before you can know whether the ground is solid. I would agree to that. He looked at her then, and the amber in his dark eyes caught the flat February light and held it. What followed in the practical months required work and patience and several uncomfortable conversations, and more than one difficult morning when one or both of them thought it might not in the end be navigable. There were days when the gap between their stations felt not like a practical problem with practical solutions, but like something older and more fundamental, something built into the structure of the world they had both been born into, and that resisted rearrangement not from malice, but from sheer accumulated weight. On those days Nora went about her work with her usual steadiness, which was the only tool she had ever had, and which had always eventually been sufficient. On those days Edmund went for long walks along the elm avenue, which the rooks disapproved of at volume, and came back looking as though the cold had done something useful to the argument he had been having with himself. There were conversations with Mrs. Bracewell that were honest and not easy. There were conversations with a solicitor that were formal and genuine and took some time. There were conversations in the village and in certain county drawing rooms that were neither kind nor accurate, and that required a degree of indifference that was harder to maintain than it was to describe. There were mornings when Nora sat in her small room and looked at the wall and reminded herself of what she had thought in the February garden, about uncertain territory and the question of whether the ground would be solid, and found that it still seemed right, which was the most she could ask of any premise. His mother came in March, the Dowager Duchess, who had raised a formidable man and was formidable herself in the way of people who have simply never decided to be otherwise. She arrived on a Thursday in a carriage that was old but impeccably kept, attended by a maid of 30 years' service and a hat of considerable authority. She spent the first morning with Edmund in the study, and Nora, who was dusting the library down the corridor, heard nothing of what was said, but heard the quality of the conversation. Two people who knew each other very well saying difficult things with the efficiency of long practice. The afternoon she spent with Nora in the formal parlour, in 2 chairs before a fire that one of the footmen had lit specially and had taken some pains over. The Dowager asked questions that were direct and covered a great deal of ground without any attempt to soften them. She asked about Nora's family, her father's situation, her mother's, her 3 years at the rectory at Moorholt, and what she had learnt there and what she had not. She asked what Nora understood about the position she was considering entering, what she understood about the county and the people in it, and their opinions, and whether she had thought carefully about the specific variety of discomfort that those opinions would produce over the next several years, until they either shifted or she ceased to care about them. She asked these things with the manner of someone not trying to discourage, but trying to establish whether the person sitting opposite her was clear-eyed rather than romantic. Nora answered them in the same spirit, without performance and without deflection, because she thought that was the respect the Dowager was owed. She said she was not ignorant of the practical difficulties. She said she did not have a great deal to lose, and that this made certain kinds of courage easier than they might otherwise be. She said that Edmund was a man she had come to understand, and that she believed she could be useful to him in the work of continuing to live, and that this seemed to her a more solid foundation than most of what she had observed people marrying on. The Dowager was quiet for a moment after this last remark. Then she said it was a somewhat unusual way of putting it. Nora agreed that it was. At the end of the afternoon the Dowager returned to Edmund and said, in the privacy of his study, that the girl had more good sense than any woman he had been introduced to in 5 proper seasons, and that she could see exactly why he felt as he did. This was not precisely approval, it was considerably more than objection. In the language the Dowager had developed over 50 years of meaning more than she said, it was the closest available translation of blessing. On a morning in May, when the elms were in full leaf and the rooks were at the height of their seasonal enthusiasm, Edmund Calder stood in the drawing-room of Ashvale Park with his housekeeper, his cook, his solicitor, Thomas the footman, the second housemaid, and the rest of the indoor staff, and he took Nora Ashby's hands in his and said private things that are not repeated here, and she looked at him and said her own things in return, in the same tone she used for all true things, quietly and without hedging. Afterward, turning back to the household, he looked at Thomas, who was standing next to the second housemaid with the sustained expression of a man in considerable internal distress. For heaven's sake, in his clear, dry way, tell her. Thomas went the colour of the wine carpet in the east corridor. The second housemaid, who had known for some time but had found the suspense interesting, laughed. It was the loud, surprised kind of laugh, the kind that has been kept too long in a small space and escapes involuntarily, and it caught and spread, and for a few minutes the drawing-room of Ashvale Park was full of the sound of people who had been quiet for a very long time doing the opposite. The particular relief of it rising through the room like heat through the old stone walls. Cook did not laugh. She stood near the window with her hands folded and an expression that she would later claim was occasioned by something in her eye, and everyone who knew her agreed that this was almost certainly the case. That afternoon Nora walked in the east garden alone for a quarter of an hour before Edmund came to find her. She was standing near the raised bed along the wall, looking at the place where the snowdrop had been. The snowdrop was long gone, as snowdrops go in May, finished with the work it had come to do and no longer needed for it. But the soil around where it had stood was dark and loose and full of green, the narcissus long since bloomed and fading, and behind them the first rises of summer bulbs, the invisible architecture of what was coming next. Already underway, and already certain of itself in the way that things are certain when they have been growing in the dark for a long time and are finally permitted to come up. He came and stood beside her and looked at the same place. It held all winter. He looked at her. The rook's nest, after they rebuilt it. He looked up at the elm avenue, where the rooks were conducting their usual May afternoon negotiations, argumentative and settled and entirely at home in their surroundings, as though the elms had been constructed specifically for their use, and they had always known it. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked together toward the house, which had all its windows open for the first time since October, letting the warm May air move through it room by room, through the formal parlours and the library and the long corridor with the wine-coloured carpet, through the study at the east end where the fire had burned all winter and where the door now stood open wide to the afternoon light, the room breathing at last, the air moving freely through it, the way it does when a house has been given permission to be itself again. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.